We are ready to go. My name is Mina Jane. I am one of the programming librarians at the Cary Library, and I'm really thrilled to be here with Tina Cassidy, who is just a phenomenal writer. I will talk to her about her in just a minute, but I wanted to let you know a couple things. One is that we're partnering with the League of Women Voters to bring this program to you tonight, and we have been partnering with them all summer on voting programs once a week, so definitely check our calendar for them. It's been an amazing summer of learning all about the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote and all of the things that go into voting and the things that we are concerned about. So please check that out. I'd like to thank the Cary Library Foundation for supporting all of our adult programs. We could not do this without them. This is being recorded by LexMedia. We always love when they come and join us because they do a really good job, and we enjoy having them with us. The Q&A, it will follow Tina's presentation. You can feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and I will feed Tina the questions. At that time, you can also unmute yourself to ask questions if you feel like you're not getting heard. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Tina Cassidy, who wrote Mr. President, How Long Must We Wait? Alice Paul Woodrow Wilson and the Fight for the Right to Vote, which is the book we're talking about today, which again celebrates the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, which is coming up in August. She's also written Birth, The Surprising History of How We Were Born, and Jackie After O, the one remarkable year when Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis defied expectations and rediscovered her dreams. Tina is a former journalist who spent most of her career at the Boston Globe covering business, fashion, and politics. She's the chief marketing officer at WGBH, and she serves on the board of the Conservation US. She lives in the Boston area with her writer husband, Anthony Flint, and they have 3 kids and a Norfolk Terrier named Dusty. I needed to include that because I feel like that's very important. So I'm going to hand it over to Tina. Thank you so much for being here. I can't wait for your talk.
Thank you so much, Mina. And I wanted to say that I am really grateful to be able to speak with you all tonight, and wanted to thank the Cary Memorial Library and the League of Women Voters as well for putting this together. It's certainly an important time to talk about voting rights in America. So I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see a PowerPoint. It won't be a long presentation, but I think sometimes the visual slides are fun to look at. And I'll read 3 brief passages from my book so that you can get a sense for how the narrative was put together.
I forgot to ask if everybody could turn their videos off during the presentation, just for the recording.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay, there we go. All right, great. I do hear it clicking in the background. I don't know if there's one person who is not muted yet.
It was me. I'm
no,
sorry. I'm on mute now.
No worries. So while my book is obviously a historical narrative of how Alice Paul fought President Woodrow Wilson and won voting rights for women, the parallels between the century-old story and what's happening today are what really compel me the most, reflecting contemporary issues about patriotism, racism, what's the right way to protest, how slow the pace of change can be, and whether a movement can be divided and still be successful, and also how to right the wrongs of inequality. First, a little background on this story. In the summer of 2016, I saw a trending hashtag on Twitter for Women's Equality Day, and I didn't know what that was all about. So I did a little digging and realized that it marked the day in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was ratified, essentially granting the vote to half of the population of America. I didn't know the story of how that all came to be. It certainly was never part of my history curriculum growing up. And, I thought that it was certainly a worthwhile story, and that's why I wrote a book about it. So first, who was Alice Paul and what can we learn from her today? She was a Quaker from New Jersey, and her parents instilled in her the belief that everyone is equal. She was educated at a time when not many girls were, and she wanted to fight for social justice, which led her to a Quaker institute in England where she could learn more about it. And there she saw the Pankhursts. This is Emmeline Pankhurst being arrested outside Parliament. And Emmeline was the matriarch of a family of girls. She had two daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. And they were the leaders of the more militant suffragette movement. And I will explain that the term suffragette in England was meant to be diminutive. It was insulting. The ETTE at the end was a way of putting women down. He used the term. And of course, women really adopted the term and made it their own so that it would no longer be insulting but empowering. In America, the term was used occasionally, but I tend not to use the term unless it's in quotes because it is meant to be derogatory. So these women, the Pankhursts, had the audacity to speak on soapboxes and on street corners. They organized marches and rallies for votes for women. And Alice Paul was captivated not just by what Pankhursts were doing, but by how they were treated in response. And she was so outraged by their arrest and harassment that she put her life on hold and joined them. And in those couple of years in England, she learned everything she needed to know, mostly outside the classroom, to advance the women's movement in America. She sailed back home to get a master's degree at the University of Pennsylvania and decided to join the American suffrage cause, which was stuck in a rut. Let's pause for a moment on this time. So Alice Paul was not yet a lawyer. She'd received her first of 3 law degrees in 1922. But at this time, in 1913, she was a student and an activist, and she knew that laws were skewed against women. Her master's degree from Penn was called, her master's thesis from Penn was called Toward Equality, and it carefully picked apart all the laws that made women property of men. They were not allowed to own land, to get a divorce without losing their kids or their home. They were unable even to have their own bank account up until the 70s when men still had to sign for them. These were all the ways that laws were stacked against women. Every state had its own rules that kept women as subordinate lesser citizens. The old school suffragists, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, did not believe the federal government would ever grant the franchise to women. And so they respectfully asked for voting rights at the state level. And as you can see here, since the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, they had made little progress. By 1913, for example, women only had full voting rights in 6 states, all out west. Those are the ones in white: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, and California. This is why Alice Paul believed it was time for a new strategy, a federal amendment. She joined the main suffrage group called the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the National American for short, and tried to agitate within the existing framework for a new approach. At first, the National American humored Paul. She asked them if she could organize a suffrage procession, and they reluctantly agreed. So on March 3rd, 1913, one day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, Alice Paul made history. On the left, you have Inez Milholland, whom Alice Paul chose to lead the parade because, frankly, she was not just a brilliant lawyer and suffragist, but she was also young and beautiful, which was the opposite of the stereotypical suffragist, this portrayal of the anti-suffragists, that women who wanted the vote were old and unattractive. Alice Paul was nothing if not sharp when it came to public relations, but her strategy was not seamless. And while the parade was successful in generating attention, it did reveal some deep divisions. And this is one of the first parallels between then and now that I'd like to discuss, and that's how racism spoils democracy. So I'm going to read a very short passage about the morning of the procession, and it focuses on Ida B. Wells, whom you can see here on the right. The college section featured 1,000 females in their academic robes, Paul among them, too humble to march up front with the National Americans leadership, holding banners from Swarthmore, Bryn Mawr, Vassar, Wellesley, Smith, Goucher, George Washington, Radcliffe, Michigan, and Cornell. Howard, a historically Black college, was also represented with a contingent of nearly 40 women of color. Most of them were members of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, founded the previous month for the purposes of joining the march. Women of color also mixed within the labor section, portraying massive wage inequality. A float carried dirty, disheveled women and children bending over sewing machines, for example. Paul deliberately arranged the 39 non-suffrage states behind this group in alphabetical order, beginning with Alabama and ending with Wisconsin. In the middle of this lineup was the Illinois contingent, a group of 65 that included Ida B. Wells, a prominent African-American journalist who, years before, had exposed the widespread horror of lynching and had sued the railroad successfully for not letting her sit in the women's car. She had also helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. While the march was a shocking and radical act, the likes of which had never occurred in America, racially integrating the procession was even more so, and it almost did not happen. Earlier in the day, when the Illinois women lined up for a practice drill, their leader, Grace Wilbur Trout, saw Wells and questioned whether she should be there. Her racist comment shocked the group, sending a buzz through the crowd. Some were so embarrassed they were speechless. Trout explained herself by saying, "Many of the Eastern and Southern women have greatly resented the fact that there are to be colored women in the delegations." By the way, Alice Paul invited women of color to participate, and when word got out that she did that, many asked her to take back the invites. And she didn't explicitly do so. She sort of just stopped promoting, including women of color. And of course, they showed up that day, and she did nothing about it. Some have even gone so far as to say they will not march if Negro women are allowed to take part. She blamed the decision on the leader of the National as well as on Alice Paul. Trout looked around for approval and found some, but another suffragist, Virginia Brooks, came to the defense of Wells. "We have come here to march for equal rights," Brooks said, adding that if the women of other states lack moral courage, we should show that we are not afraid of public opinion. Wells was deeply hurt by Trout's remarks and let slip 2 large tears, which she wiped from beneath her veil. "If the Illinois women do not take a stand now in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost," Wells said before storming off. At some point after the procession began, Wells jumped back into the Illinois delegation to march in her rightful place, while Black women also marched with the Delaware, New York, West Virginia, and Michigan sections. There was one group, however, that was segregated in the back. When word spread that Mary Church Terrell, a prominent African-American, would lead a strong showing of the National Association of Colored Women, and that Southerners threatened to boycott, the men's section offered to march between these Black and white groups. So in addition to the racial conflict after the march, Paul formed a committee for the federal amendment and tried to raise money for it. But the National American thought that as well was far too radical, and they kicked her out of their organization and viewed her as competition. So she was left on her own, having to build a new organization from scratch. So just talking about protest then and now, obviously protest has been part of our national conversation, again, for a few years, whether it's Colin Kaepernick taking a knee during the national anthem or the Black Lives Matter movement being resurgent right now. Very often people will attack the fact that protesters are protesting, even if it is a nonviolent protest. They'll often say that it is disrespectful or unpatriotic. That's certainly what they said to Alice Paul. But she didn't march to the White House in a protest per se. It was meant to be a thought-provoking display of the contributions women make in society. There were no provocative signs, aside from those asking for voting rights. But it didn't matter what form their protests took. The Wilson administration and its supporters were really outraged, not about what the suffragists were doing with their protests, but about what they were demanding, which was voting rights. So I'll read another short passage now to show the wide array of creative, nonviolent protests that Paul employed over a 4-year span, all during Woodrow Wilson's first term. These were protests that still made people angry. And the scene that I'm about to pick up, the scene that I'm about to read picks up with Paul's suffragists leaving an unsuccessful meeting with Woodrow Wilson. This was one of many. Just an interesting sidebar is that at this time in history, and Woodrow Wilson was also very keen on government reform and government transparency, you could basically knock on the door of the Oval Office and ask for a meeting and get one. So Alice Paul and the suffragists had done this a number of times. And so here they are again, having met with Woodrow Wilson in the Oval Office, and now they're being sent back home, if you will. The women slowly made their exit from the East Room of the White House and returned to their new headquarters. After 4 years of toil and hardship in the damp basement on F Street, the National Women's Party, which was the name of the organization that Alice Paul created, was finally in a sunlit place of prominence. Cameron House stood at 21 Madison Place on the edge of Lafayette Park in front of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. The building, a wide 3-story brick townhouse, had several benefits. First, it was visible and just 200 steps away from the White House. The Wilsons could see the suffrage flag fluttering from its perch on the 3rd floor balcony. I love that idea. Second, there was ample space to work and entertain guests, from tourists and strangers walking in off the street to catch a glimpse of the women, to those attending ever-expanding fundraisers. There were also bedrooms to accommodate Paul and others, eliminating their daily commute. Paul was now using Susan B. Anthony's old desk, a Victorian cylinder roll top that Anthony's secretary had donated to the National Women's Party. When the indignant suffragists walked through Cameron House's front door, they entered into a great hall with a large staircase and a fireplace that burned eternal. Paul was there waiting for them, ready to stoke their anger as they dropped into comfortable chairs in front of the flames and asked the question again: how long must we wait? With the women assembled in front of the fire, Paul pitched a carefully orchestrated idea, which she asked Harriet Stanton Blatch to present. Harriet Stanton Blatch was Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, just in case you hadn't put that together. We have got to take a new departure, Blatch told them. We have got to bring to the president day by day, week in, week out, the idea that great numbers of women want to be free, will be free, and want to know what he's going to do about it. We need to have a silent vigil in front of the White House until his inauguration in March. Let us stand beside the gateway where he must pass in and out so that he can never fail to realize that there is a tremendous earnestness and insistence in back of this measure. So far, with Paul as their leader, the women had marched 4 years earlier in 1913 in one of the largest and most outrageous protests America had ever seen. They had assembled an 80-car brigade to deliver signatures from all over the nation. They had testified, editorialized, and reorganized. They had formed their own political party. They had held May Day parades in nearly every state in the Union. They raised funds and actively worked to defeat Democrats. Democrats were the party in power. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive Democrat, but he was certainly conservative on social issues. And that was a very radical idea, because up until this point, suffragists had never gotten political, which I know sounds strange, but they never made it about one party or another. And Alice Paul believed, well, we have to hold the party in power responsible if they are not allowing suffrage to move forward. And Wilson just happened to have been a Democrat. In addition to raising funds and actively working to defeat Democrats, they also had a booth at a global exposition, collected a miles-long scroll of signatures, and drove it cross-country from Seattle. You can see the women here on the right. They drove this jalopy cross-country at a time when there was no interstate highway system, no street lamps. They would get stuck in the mud. They had to fix their own mechanical issues. So, and they also called in their story from the road, and it was published in Alice Paul's weekly suffrage newspaper called The Suffragist. And that's how she made most of her fundraising money, was from people signing up to receive that newspaper. In addition, they had also dropped leaflets from the sky. You can see Lucy Burns here in the back of this biplane flying over Seattle. It's one of my all-time favorite suffrage pictures. And they had sacrificed one of their own. Inez Milholland, that woman on the horse in the front of the parade, she basically died as part of, while she was on the Western campaign. And her final words were something like, how long must we wait? So now they had a martyr. And on this day, with the women back from the White House, as they sat in front of the crackling fire at their new headquarters with the White House at their backs, they may have been exhausted, but they were neither depleted of ideas nor the passion to continue the struggle. They listened as Blatch offered a new form of protest. In America, pickets had become a common Union tactic, typically ending in violence. But suffragists had been employing the practice as well. Blatch had used pickets in her Votes for Women campaign with the New York legislature in 1912. So when she delivered her final plea to the women of Cameron House, they stirred. Will you not, she asked, be a silent sentinel of liberty and self-government? And so now we enter a new phase, really. And this was the silent sentinels standing in front of the White House. But it turns out that Washingtonians thought women standing silently, holding signs, was even more outrageous than any of the things that I've just mentioned. And it triggered a series of unwarranted arrests with sentences up to 6 months. It's good to know that local women played a key role in all of this. You have Catherine Morey here on the left. She was from Brookline. She was one of those White House pickets, and she was arrested and thrown in prison. Her mother, Agnes, here in the middle, she lived in Boston and was chair of the Massachusetts National Women's Party contingent, and she too picketed in front of the White House. She was also a speaker on the suffrage special train, which traveled across America, doing whistle-stop talks about votes for women. And the third woman on the right is Florida Ruffin Ridley, a journalist who wrote for outlets such as the Boston Globe. She grew up on Charles Street in Boston's West End and came from a prominent family. Her father was a Harvard Law grad and the first Black judge in America. And her mother was a civil rights activist. And there is a school in Brookline, one of the elementary schools that was just renamed from a man who had been a slave owner to, in her honor. It's now called the Ridley School. Another woman, Frances Fowler, who must have eluded photographers in her life because she's not pictured here, and I have not been able to find a photograph of her anywhere. But she demonstrated in Boston when Wilson arrived here from Europe, traveling back from the First World War. And she was arrested for loitering on Boston Common. At that time, if you loitered for more than 7 minutes, you could be arrested. And she spent 8 days in the Charles Street jail over this. So as these women were being arrested for being silent sentinels, they decided to go on hunger strikes, which is something that Alice Paul learned how to do when she was studying with the Pankhurst in England. On the left, you can see an artist's depiction of this forced feeding. And on the right, you have Lucy Burns, the woman who had been pictured in the back of that biplane. She and Alice Paul met in prison in London. Both Americans had been arrested at a Pankhurst gathering. And they became the dynamic duo of the movement. Lucy Burns was Alice Paul's number 2. So to protest the sentences, the incarcerated women went on hunger strikes. As I mentioned, Alice Paul was committed to a psychiatric ward, which if you look on the picture on the left, in the top right corner, there appears to be a window that is boarded up. That was Alice Paul's window. They didn't want her to see out or to hear. And her friends would gather beneath the window and shout encouragement up to her and sing her songs. She was certainly not in need of being in a psychiatric ward. They were trying to convict her of being obsessed with Woodrow Wilson. which she probably was, in fairness, at this point in the game, but she had every right to be, and I think not obsessed in a clinical way. So all of this really created much more sympathy for the women who were involved and for the movement in general. Next, I'd like to talk about similarities between Woodrow Wilson and our current rise in white nationalism. One of the first things Wilson did after he was elected president was to segregate the civil service. As the first president elected from the South since Reconstruction, this move empowered white supremacists, triggered racial violence, lynchings included, and gave the KKK the boost it needed. In fact, Wilson even screened the first movie ever in the White House, and it was called Birth of a Nation, which is about the Ku Klux Klan. A friend of him had essentially created this film. So racism combined with nationalism for another combustible mix. And when the First World War erupted, Wilson clamped down on the First Amendment, attacking not just the press, but individuals who were criticizing him. And on the streets, there was a mob mentality. If any seemingly able-bodied man or those with a foreign accent were seen or heard in public, they were assumed to be a spy. Otherwise, why weren't they off fighting in Europe? Vigilantes would beat them, drag them to the police, and the government supported this practice, due process be damned. Going after those he believed to be seditious extended to Alice Paul and the rest of the silent sentinels. And of course, Russia played a role in all of this as well. I'll read another passage here. This scene begins with suffragists arriving in shifts to their posts outside the White House gates to stand silently with their signs. The next day, a car dropped off Lucy Burns, Dora Lewis, and their heavy cargo in front of the White House about an hour before the Russians were expected to meet with Woodrow Wilson at 12:30. The women unfurled their 10-foot hand-stenciled cloth sign stretched between two wooden posts, shuffled into position, and straightened the banner between them. The crowd, many of them on their lunch hour, slowed to read the wordy message, and it's what you see here on the left. As pedestrians proceeded, the words, some scribbled to transcribe the banner, the situation grew tense. To attack the president so directly in front of diplomatic guests was an unprecedented outrage, not only for those witnessing the protest from inside the White House, but for many who saw it happening in the street. Murmurs rippled through the crowd and cars stopped to take in the scene. The Russians, arriving by motorcade, passed quickly through the gate, but with enough time to see the sign. Bystanders, men and women alike, were enraged that the delegation had seen the protest. Take down that banner or I'm through with woman suffrage for life, one man screamed at Burns. Lewis argued with the man as he stormed off and ignored her. You are a friend to the enemy and a disgrace to your country, one woman sneered at the protesters. Why don't you take that banner to Berlin? You are helping the enemy. So past is indeed prologue, and we have so much to learn from the suffrage movement. For example, when we're fighting for democratic ideals, we need to include everyone, or else we're not really fighting for democracy, are we? We're only fighting for some people. Change is hard, and it can take a very long time. The first women's rights convention at Seneca Falls was in 1848, so it would be another 72 years before women could vote. And even then, not all women. Black women and Black men faced disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests at the state and local level. The federal government did not recognize Native Americans as citizens until 1924, so they could not vote. Those of Asian descent could not become citizens and vote until 1952 due to the Asian Exclusion Act. And the Voting Rights Act, meant to address all of the barriers to voting, passed in 1965, and yet voter suppression continues. There's always more work to do to make our union more perfect. Alice Paul knew this. In fact, her work did not end when the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. 3 years later, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, which passed Congress in 1972, but was never fully ratified by the necessary 38 states. However, in the last 3 years, Illinois in 2017, Nevada in 2018, and Virginia in March of 2020 all ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, becoming the 36th, 37th, and 38th states needed. Here you can see Jennifer Carroll Foy, who is running for governor in Virginia. It's been interesting to see how women of color have really stepped up, especially in those last 3 states mentioned, to lead this renewed push for the Equal Rights Amendment. And in recent polls have found that 90% of Americans think that the Equal Rights Amendment has passed, is actually part of our Constitution, but it is not. You might also be aware that there is movement in Congress now that 38 states have ratified. There's legislation to remove a time limit that basically would mandate that these recent ratifications are too late. And who knows where this will all end? It could end up at the Supreme Court, or we could have different leadership in the White House and in Congress next year, and the ERA could finally move. Here you can see that this is the current map of the ERA yes states. Doesn't it look similar to the map that I showed earlier? Same states that refuse to grant voting rights to women, by and large, are the same states that are against the Equal Rights Amendment. But the women pushing for the ERA know that change is slow and the work is never ending. And I think that they must take their inspiration from something that Alice Paul once said, which is carry the banner always. So thank you very much. And I would love to take comments or questions.
So Myra asked, which school in Brookline was renamed?
It was the Coolidge Corner School briefly while they were trying to come up with it. And then it was, oh my goodness, I'm totally spacing on the old name. I blocked it out. Devotion?
Does that sound right?
Yeah. So it went from Devotion to Coolidge Corner to Ridley.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious of what got you interested. Actually, do you want to turn your shared screen off? And
Sure.
okay, then we can see you. What got you interested in Alice Paul? Like, how did her story come to you?
Well, it was literally coming across this trending hashtag on Twitter. And, when you look at how the 19th Amendment passed, you can't not see Alice Paul as the sort of central figure in that story. She was the leader of that movement, even though there were women all across America who were part of it and did their part to make it happen. But I was particularly interested in not just Alice Paul, but this other figure who made the perfect foil, Woodrow Wilson. And the two of them battling it out together over the course of his entire 2 terms in office was what I thought was sort of a classic David and Goliath story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that makes sense. Let me think. So feel free to add your questions to the chat, everyone, or you can unmute yourself and ask a question directly to Tina. What do you think about the fact that it's been 100 years and we're still fighting a lot of the same fights?
Yeah, I mean, we are, and yet, there has been progress. I think what's really interesting to me is it's a lot of the same fights, right? We keep revisiting the same topics. Just within the talk that I gave tonight, we're talking about freedom of the press, or presidential antagonism of the press. We're talking about protest movements and what it takes to actually make change, and how protests can lead to change. And, nonviolent versus violent protests. And, questions such as, does every movement need a Martin Luther King and a Malcolm X? very similarly in the first wave of feminists, you've got, Alice Paul, who's sort of the Malcolm X of her time, and, the old line suffragists, whether it was Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, thought her ideas were really too far out there, too aggressive, and they were worried that if she asked for too much, there would be a backlash. Certainly issues around race, right? I mean, if Black women had been more fully included in the suffrage movement, would they have been disenfranchised so quickly, especially by the southern states? So yeah, I think, again, these are all questions that they seem to be cyclical. And, what I wanted to draw from writing this book and from others who read it is inspiration. These women fought really hard for a really long time, and eventually they got there, and thank goodness they did. I also want to make sure that people are inspired to vote by this story, because it's easy to take it for granted.
Right. Myra says she went to that school, Devotion, you said?
Yes.
Yep. And she's wondering who carries the banner now.
Good question. This is the first year with the new name, and it happened late in the year. So I haven't even been over there. I don't know what signage they've got or what's happening. It's a good question.
Okay. So Molly asks, it doesn't seem like Alice Paul has been acknowledged and celebrated as much as she deserves. Why do you think she's not a household name even among feminists?
Yes, a couple of reasons. It's a great question. I love this. This is my favorite question, by the way. First of all, Alice Paul was considered a woman who was ill-behaved, right? She was a bad girl, and feminists, the old guard feminists, certainly branded her that way. And at the very end, on the day that the amendment was signed by the Secretary of State, he basically shunned Alice Paul because he thought that, and the administration thought that she had caused the Wilson administration far too much trouble and embarrassment. But they did invite the good ladies, the ladies who were content with state level voting rights. And so that group of women essentially wrote the history. They also created the League of Women Voters. And, so the early history of this massive change in voting rights was not written by Alice Paul. It was written by the others, if you will. I will also say that Alice Paul, as a Quaker, wasn't looking for personal congratulations or fame. This was a woman who devoted her entire life to the cause of equality, and literally the day that this was signed, she went back to her office and got back to work. She obviously went to law school. She wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. She worked internationally after the Second World War, thinking globally about women's rights. She and the National Women's Party were able to get more than 300 bills passed Congress, all to help with women's equality. And so, there's really no good reason why she wasn't remembered, except she didn't really care. And her opponents made sure that she was forgotten.
Interesting. Irushi asks, who are some inspirational figures today that fight for women's rights, like Alice Paul did, that you think we should know about?
Well, there are many really amazing women fighting for women's rights today. I mean, you look at Malala and others. It's been interesting to look at the evolution of Stacey Abrams out there, really focused over the last couple of years around voting rights. There are, I think that leadership today is much more distributed. Even the Black Lives Matter movement really has women at the core of its leadership, but it's very much more distributed. And again, not necessarily about one particular individual. I think it's really amazing to see so many young people standing up for equality and change, whether it's in the gun safety movement or civil rights issues. or even just women running for office, which we have record numbers of that happening right now. So, you know, it's a great time to be a woman and to make a difference.
Myra would like to know who's leading the charge for the ERA to be ratified in the remaining states or federally?
Yeah, so we have as many states ratified as need to be. I think that Arizona is still interested in ratifying, even though there are already 38 states that have done so, but it's kind of like an extra little backup state. There are some states that want to repeal their previous positive vote for the ERA. So there are, you know, there's women from those states that have recently ratified. They're pretty prominent in the fight. There are also some organizations, including the ERA Coalition. Definitely check out their website. They are one of many groups, you know, really working to push this over the line, and perhaps in the next Congress.
Okay. Francis would like to know, can you comment on the role of Quakers in the struggle?
Yeah, so Quakers were, well, I should say, let me reverse it. Many prominent suffragists were Quakers, just like many prominent abolitionists were Quakers. And it really revolves around their religious belief in equality. You know, Alice Paul, her parents instilled in her that everyone was equal. It didn't matter if you were a girl or a boy. She got to play hockey and go to school, which were all things. And she even rode her own horse to school, which were all things that girls didn't really do. And so, you know, we owe a lot to Quaker thinking around these two very important issues.
Okay. Why do some states want to rescind the ratification?
Because they have probably become more conservative over time, or believe that the ERA is a Democratic issue, even though in a sort of general polls, 90% of people approve the ERA, and in fact already think it's part of our Constitution. So it's not really a political issue. It is a bipartisan issue. There have been Republicans that have supported it in the recent votes as well. So I think it's more of a political ploy right now than anything legitimate. And I'll bet if you asked, you know, the general public in those states how they felt about it, they would be, you know, what do you mean the Equal Rights Amendment isn't part of our Constitution already? Why are we even talking about this?
I think you're very right. Arushi says, what are some current barriers, if any, that keep women from voting?
Yeah, so you may have seen recently in a primary vote in Kentucky that they shut down many polling precincts, but they tended to do that in poor communities, and those areas had many thousands of people trying to vote in one polling place. So that's one example. You know, another example is states, you know, limiting hours at the polls. If you're a single working mother, that can certainly make it difficult. Also, you know, people who are poorer don't always have the ability to get the time off from work. And so there are a lot of barriers to voting that exist today. And I think, you know, it's thinking about what are the things that we could do to make voting more accessible to people who might be under trying circumstances. What if they don't live within walking distance of a polling place and they don't own a car? You know, what about mail-in voting, which is something that seems to be okay for collecting census data, but it seems debatable when it comes to voting. So there's a wide range of things. You know, redistricting, of course, was a really, I should say, yeah, gerrymandering was a really big part of disenfranchisement, because when you sort of carve up voting districts in such a way so that, you know, the party that you, if you're a Democrat and it's been carved up to be a majority Republican district, then you think your vote will never count. And so you stop voting. That is also, you know, a form of disenfranchisement, or sort of limiting access because you feel like your vote doesn't count anymore. So a whole bunch of things.
That makes sense. Molly says, what was the most surprising thing you learned during your research while writing this book?
Um, I mean, I knew nothing about any of this when I started, so it was all surprising and interesting to me. But that's just because I'm kind of geeky and I really love history and primary source material. But I think the big takeaway for me was the exhaustive effort that these women put into it. You know, many of these women had to leave their husbands and children. Some of them for good because they believe so much in this cause. You know, they moved to Washington and put their lives on hold. And you know, that wave that the National Women's Party led for those 8 years, that's a tremendous amount of time, like full-time round the clock work. And that was really just the capstone on the movement. If you think about the trajectory beginning all the way back at Seneca Falls. So, you know, almost a century. And you could even think about it as a longer trajectory than that. You could go back to the founding of this country. Women are, the word woman or women is not in the Constitution anywhere. And the Constitution only gives voting rights to white men, basically. And so, you know, I think it was helpful for me to put into context, you know, some of the broader issues around democracy and what it takes to ensure that democracy applies to everyone.
So sort of a follow-up to that is, what were some of your what were some of your sources and where did your research take you?
Well, lucky for me, Alice Paul's personal papers are at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. So those are in Cambridge. I also spent a lot of time at the Library of Congress, and there's so many beautiful photographs and letters and so forth that you can get there. The National Americans papers are at Rutgers, and so I spent a lot of time in the basement of the Alexander Library there. That was really creepy. That was my least favorite part of the research.
Oh, I went to
So,
Rutgers. I
yeah,
love
you
that.
did, but yeah, but the library basement at night is not fun.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
with you.
Alice Paul's house, where she grew up in, is actually open to the public. That's in Morristown, New Jersey, and it's very cool. And they, you know, literally have boxes of papers in the attic and a very knowledgeable staff. So it really is a journey that took me to many places, and you know, spent a lot of time reading British newspapers from that time. It was really fun.
It sounds it. My old stomping grounds. So I have a comment here that you had touched on this with the March of 1913. Is one of our patrons has been reading a lot about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is a fantastic woman, but also a terrible racist. Or and maybe that was part of the times, or is that just was that her? I'm not sure how to interpret this question, but
Yep,
um,
I can answer that. Nope, I'm totally familiar with the issue. Um, so it's really fascinating how this all came to be. Those early suffragists, specifically Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they're sort of the pioneers of the movement, were also very much hardcore abolitionists, which we talked about. And, you know, they were quite strident in wanting to end slavery. And when abolition happened, um, Black men got the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. And these privileged white women, like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, could not believe that Black men got the vote before them. And they were so outraged that they had been sort of left out of this, you know, voting rights progression, that they made comments out of anger that were definitely racist. And they said, well, you know, now we're only in this for ourselves. We can't be, you know, helping other groups of people. It just has to be about women getting the vote. And so, you know, if you can pick apart things that they said, and they were most definitely racist. I think it's also important to know that the amount of racism that existed in our country at that time was even worse than it is today, because, slavery was very much a modern um, thing that existed. It was still happening. I mean, there are people who were still enslaved in Texas and they didn't even know that abolition had happened. So, so that was sort of the start of it. I think when you get to Woodrow Wilson becoming president, he definitely brought a racist sensibility to America. And so, again, this backdrop of segregation and racism was everywhere. And, even Alice Paul made some regrettable comments at the very end when the 19th Amendment was going out for ratification and it was up for a vote in South Carolina. South Carolina was a Confederate state. They were like sort of virulently against this idea that Black women would get the vote. And so even though the 19th Amendment just, isn't explicit about race, Alice Paul made remarks like, "Oh, don't worry, it's just for white women," even though it wasn't. But I think she was just really at the stage of, saying whatever she thought needed to be heard just to get it over the finish line at that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you comment on the differences, if any, between the English and the American suffragists, and who got the vote first, us or them?
Them. Russia even got the vote before America. The difference really was that they were first, and they were even more, I would say, aggressive. They would think nothing of throwing rocks through windows and so forth. And Alice Paul, being a Quaker, was really not in favor of that. So, I think it was just a different flavor, and mostly because they were first and more aggressive.
Okay. You touched on this a minute ago with racism, but I was curious about why do women seem to get stuff last, or seem to? I mean, what is so frightening?
Patriarchy? It's patriarchy, right? I mean, it's a structural, cultural issue. Yeah, I mean, that is the question. Why do women get things last? And if you are, a Black or brown woman, you're even further back in the line.
Right. So at one point you had commented that the suffragettes did not want Black women involved in the march. Um, but even but did they not realize that that would sort of be helpful?
Well, no, they thought that by having Black women in the march, it would enrage all of the racists around them who were now ascendant in the Wilson administration, and that it would make it a racial issue and not a gender issue, even though, of course, for Black women, they can't separate race and gender, right? And so that was their concern. And some of them were just also racists. They did not want to march with Black women in their section. So it was sort of two parts of that. You were either racist or you were concerned that there would be a backlash because you were being inclusive. And so women were really concerned. I mean, marching in the street was radical enough, right? I mean, the march was disrupted. 100 women were injured. The ambulances couldn't get through the mob scene. And so it was quite a dangerous feat already. And it was even more dangerous for Black women. I often think it would have taken a lot of guts for women to march, but if you were Black, you had more of a target on your back for sure.
Mm-hmm.
There were Black women who also were among the silent sentinels. Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were among the pickets. And to think about what that must have felt like for them, putting their body on the line like that, it's pretty remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Now, didn't the Black women get the vote with the Black men though? So they actually got the vote sooner than white women?
Black men got the vote, yes, with the 15th Amendment right after the Civil War. And so, again, much time passed. And no, it did not include Black women. And Southern, just given the math, just the demographic math in the South, if Black women were to get the vote, it was going to be definitely a problem for white supremacists in the South. And so, it's really helpful to take a step back and realize that Alice Paul's whole approach to a federal amendment was in and of itself an act of anti-racism, because she knew that the Southern states would never allow women the vote because of Black women. And so the only way to get around that was to make it a federal amendment. So yes, I mean, obviously white women benefited from this as much as Black women. I think the real issue with the amendment was that it didn't explicitly call out Black women or white women, or terms under which women could be disenfranchised. And Black women saw this coming. They knew that even though this amendment gave them the vote, people were already looking for ways to take it away. And it's a really interesting construct to think about, even in terms of the Equal Rights Amendment. So I will say that, when Alice Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, it's very simple. It basically says, you can't discriminate based on sex. That's it. It's one sentence, and it's very simple. There are others who say, maybe we need a newly written Equal Rights Amendment that is explicit in saying, you can't discriminate based on sex. You can't discriminate based on religion. You can't discriminate based on your ability or your religion or your gender identity. So, should we start over with a newly written Equal Rights Amendment that is more inclusive? Or do we say, okay, we're this close to the finish line, let's just not let perfect be the enemy of good and get this done? For me, that's very much the dilemma that Alice Paul and others faced as the racial issues became more apparent near the end of the ratification process for the 19th Amendment.
Okay. Jean asks, after the amendment passed, did Alice Paul work to get women out to vote and run for office?
Say that one more time.
After the amendment passed, did Alice Paul work to get women out to vote and run for office?
That's an interesting question. They did create suffrage schools to teach people both how to advocate for suffrage and later how to vote. But the real work was done by the League of Women Voters, which was created by the National American Group. And, they are also celebrating their centennial year coming up soon. And, they've done great work. Definitely. But Alice Paul was not focused on getting women to run for office per se. She was focused on changing the laws.
Mm-hmm. So we don't have any more questions, but did you want to say anything in closing?
Just that this has been a really wonderful talk, and it's nice to see you all. And I'm glad that you are engaging with your local library. It's very important, and really appreciate Cary Memorial Library putting this together and the whole voting series. So I'm going to check out the rest of it.
Thank you so much. They're actually really interesting. I would like to thank you for taking the time to talk with us, and everybody here. Well, remember that you can find Tina's books at any indie bookstore. How long must we wait? Thank you.
All right.
Thank LexMedia for recording, and the League of Women Voters. I did want to say, I forgot to tell you that Florence Del Santo said to say hello. She said she used to work with you at the Boston Globe.
Yes. Oh, hi to Florence.
She is now with LexMedia.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Small world.
Definitely. So thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for coming, and we hope to see you again soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.